Sarah Chun had always been the kind of person who blended into the background. At 28, she possessed an unremarkable appearance that served her well in her chosen profession. Standing at average height with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, she moved through the military base with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew exactly where she belonged and what she was supposed to do. To her fellow soldiers, she was simply the medic, competent, reliable, and utterly ordinary. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Phoenix as Sarah made her rounds through the medical tent. The base, located in the volatile region near the Afghan-Pakistani border, housed nearly 300 coalition forces. For the past 18 months, Sarah had served as one of 4 medics assigned to the camp, treating everything from minor cuts and bruises to more serious combat injuries when patrols returned from their missions. Her colleagues knew her as a dedicated healthcare provider who rarely spoke unless spoken to. She performed her duties with methodical precision, checking supplies, updating medical records, and ensuring that every soldier under her care received the attention they needed. What they didn't know was that Sarah Chun carried secrets that would have shocked them to their core. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez had been watching Sarah for weeks, though not for the reasons one might expect. As the camp's intelligence officer, he had developed an eye for details that others missed. There was something about the way Sarah moved, the way she observed her surroundings, that suggested military training far beyond basic medical instruction. Her posture was too perfect, her situational awareness too acute, and her calm under pressure too practiced for someone whose only experience was treating wounded soldiers. The first hint of Sarah's hidden abilities came during a routine supply convoy that had been attacked 3 miles from the base. The medics were called to prepare for incoming casualties, and Sarah worked alongside her teammates to set up triage areas and prepare medical equipment. When the helicopters arrived carrying the wounded, chaos erupted in the medical tent. 7 soldiers had been injured in the ambush, with injuries ranging from shrapnel wounds to severe burns. The medical team was overwhelmed, trying to prioritize treatment while working with limited resources. Sarah found herself assigned to treat Sergeant David Murphy, a communications specialist who had taken shrapnel to his shoulder and was bleeding heavily. As she worked to stop the bleeding and assess the extent of his injuries, Murphy began describing the attack in detail. He spoke of the precision with which the enemy had positioned themselves, the timing of their assault, and the weapons they had used. Most medics would have focused solely on the medical treatment, offering words of comfort while working to stabilize their patient. Sarah, however, asked questions that surprised Murphy. She wanted to know about the terrain where the attack occurred, the number of enemy combatants involved, and their apparent level of training. Her questions were specific and tactical, demonstrating knowledge that went far beyond basic military awareness. Murphy, despite his pain, found himself providing detailed answers to someone he had assumed was just a medic. Lieutenant Rodriguez, who had been present during the medical emergency to debrief the wounded soldiers, noticed Sarah's line of questioning. He made mental notes about her interest in tactical details and her apparent understanding of combat operations. When the medical crisis had passed and the wounded soldiers had been stabilized, Rodriguez decided to pay closer attention to the quiet medic who seemed to know more than she let on. Over the following days, Rodriguez began observing Sarah more carefully. He noticed that she always seemed to know where everyone was on the base, that she had an uncanny ability to predict when trouble might arise, and that she maintained friendships with soldiers from various units, something that gave her access to information from across the entire operation. Sarah was aware of Rodriguez's attention, though she gave no indication of it. She had been trained to notice when she was being watched, and the intelligence officer's interest in her was both expected and concerning. She knew that maintaining her cover was crucial, but she also understood that complete invisibility was impossible in such a confined environment. The truth was that Sarah Chun was not just a medic. 3 years earlier, she had been recruited by a classified military intelligence program designed to place specially trained operatives in conventional military units. These operatives, known internally as embedded assets, received extensive medical training to serve as functional medics while simultaneously gathering intelligence and providing specialized capabilities when needed. Sarah's real name was Sarah Elizabeth Chun, and she held the rank of major in a unit that officially didn't exist. She had completed training programs that included advanced combat techniques, intelligence gathering, communications interception, and psychological operations. Her medical training, while genuine, was secondary to her primary mission of providing intelligence support to coalition forces in the region. The program that had trained Sarah was the brainchild of military strategists who recognized that traditional intelligence gathering methods were often insufficient in modern conflict zones. By embedding specially trained operatives within regular military units, they could gather real-time intelligence, identify threats that might otherwise go unnoticed, and provide specialized capabilities without drawing attention from enemy forces. Sarah had volunteered for the program after completing her initial military service as a genuine medic. She had shown exceptional aptitude for observation and analysis, along with the psychological profile needed to maintain deep cover for extended periods. Her training had taken 2 years and had transformed her from a competent medic into a highly skilled intelligence operative. The selection process for embedded assets was rigorous and secretive. Candidates underwent extensive psychological evaluation to ensure they could maintain their cover identities under extreme stress. They received training in multiple disciplines, including advanced combat techniques, surveillance and counter-surveillance, communications technology, and cultural analysis. Most importantly, they learned to think and act like the professionals they were pretending to be while maintaining constant awareness of their real mission. Sarah's cover as a medic was particularly effective because it provided her with legitimate access to personnel throughout the base. Soldiers who might be reluctant to speak with intelligence officers often opened up to medical personnel, sharing information about their experiences, concerns, and observations. This access allowed Sarah to build a comprehensive picture of the operational environment while maintaining the trust and respect of her colleagues. Lieutenant Rodriguez continued his subtle surveillance of Sarah, looking for patterns or behaviors that might confirm his suspicions. He noticed that she seemed to have an unusual interest in the base's communications equipment, often volunteering to assist with medical evacuations that required coordination with outside units. He also observed that she maintained detailed personal notes that went beyond standard medical documentation. What Rodriguez didn't realize was that Sarah was equally aware of him and had begun conducting her own assessment of the intelligence officer. She recognized that his interest in her could compromise her mission, but she also saw potential value in establishing a connection with someone in his position. Intelligence operatives often needed to make quick decisions about whether to maintain cover or reveal themselves when circumstances changed, and Sarah was beginning to consider whether Rodriguez might become an asset or a threat. The dynamic between Sarah and Rodriguez represented one of the fundamental challenges of the embedded asset program. While the operatives were designed to work independently and maintain their cover at all costs, there were situations where cooperation with other intelligence personnel might be necessary. The program's protocols addressed these scenarios, but the decision-making process remained complex and dangerous. Sarah's daily routine continued to provide her with valuable intelligence about base operations and regional security threats. Through her interactions with soldiers returning from patrols, she learned about changes in enemy tactics, the location of suspected weapon caches, and the movement patterns of local populations. Her medical duties gave her access to detailed after-action reports and casualty information that painted a comprehensive picture of the security situation. The intelligence she gathered was transmitted through carefully established channels that appeared to be routine medical communications. Sarah used encrypted messages embedded in standard medical reports and supply requests to pass information to her handlers without arousing suspicion. These communications were designed to look like normal administrative traffic while containing detailed intelligence assessments. As Sarah continued her work at Camp Phoenix, she began to notice patterns in the attacks on coalition forces that suggested a more sophisticated enemy organization than had been previously assessed. The timing and coordination of recent incidents indicated that hostile forces had developed detailed knowledge of coalition operations and were using this information to plan increasingly effective attacks. This intelligence was exactly the kind of information that the Embedded Asset Program had been designed to uncover. Sarah's unique position allowed her to correlate medical treatment data with operational information to identify patterns that might not be visible to traditional intelligence analysts. Her medical background provided her with insights into the types of weapons being used and the training level of enemy combatants, while her intelligence training allowed her to understand the broader strategic implications of these observations. The challenge for Sarah was determining how to act on this intelligence without compromising her cover or putting the soldiers under her care at risk. The Embedded Asset Program had strict protocols about when and how operatives could reveal their true capabilities, and premature disclosure could have serious consequences for both the operative and the mission. As the weeks passed, Sarah found herself in an increasingly difficult position. The intelligence she had gathered suggested that Camp Phoenix was likely being targeted for a major attack, but she couldn't warn her colleagues without revealing her true identity. She began to prepare for the possibility that she might need to abandon her cover and take more direct action to protect the soldiers who had come to trust her as their medic. The stage was being set for events that would test everything Sarah had learned during her training and force her to make decisions that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone at Camp Phoenix. The quiet medic who had spent months blending into the background was about to face circumstances that would require her to step forward and reveal abilities that no one suspected she possessed. The morning of October 15th began like any other at Camp Phoenix, but Sarah Chun noticed details that others missed. The local staff who usually arrived early to begin their work in the kitchens and maintenance areas were conspicuously absent. The bread delivery that normally came at dawn never appeared. Even the wild dogs that scavenged near the camp's perimeter seemed restless, pacing and whining in a way that suggested they sensed something amiss. Sarah documented these observations in her private notes, using a code that would appear meaningless to anyone who might accidentally discover her writings. To a casual observer, her notebook contained routine medical observations about camp hygiene and health conditions. In reality, she was recording intelligence indicators that painted a picture of an impending threat. Lieutenant Rodriguez had also noticed the absence of local workers, but he attributed it to the kind of random disruptions that were common in the region. Political tensions, family obligations, or simply the unpredictable nature of local employment could explain why people didn't show up for work. He filed a routine report, but didn't consider the situation particularly significant. What Rodriguez didn't know was that Sarah had been tracking patterns of local behavior for months. She had observed that the civilian workers typically gave subtle warnings before significant attacks occurred. Sometimes they would mention family visits or religious obligations that required them to be away from the base. Other times they would simply stop showing up without explanation. The current absence was too widespread and too sudden to be coincidental. Sarah's training had taught her to look for these kinds of indicators. Local populations often had advanced knowledge of planned attacks, either because they were sympathetic to hostile forces or because they had learned to recognize the warning signs themselves. Civilian workers at military installations were particularly valuable sources of intelligence because they observed daily routines and could identify when normal patterns were disrupted. The Embedded Asset Program had provided Sarah with extensive training in reading these environmental indicators. She had learned to correlate seemingly unrelated events to build a comprehensive picture of threat levels. The absence of local workers, combined with increased radio chatter that she had detected during her routine monitoring of communications equipment, suggested that something significant was being planned. As the day progressed, Sarah noticed additional signs that reinforced her growing concern. The medical supplies that were normally restocked on Tuesdays had not arrived, and when she contacted the supply depot, she was told that the convoy had been delayed due to security concerns along the route. This was the third consecutive week that scheduled deliveries had been disrupted, suggesting a pattern of interference with coalition logistics. During her lunch break, Sarah made a point of speaking with soldiers who had returned from morning patrols. She framed her questions as medical concerns about environmental health and safety, asking about air quality, water sources, and any unusual observations they might have made. Through these conversations, she learned that several patrols had reported unusual vehicle movements in nearby villages and had observed unfamiliar faces in areas where they typically encountered the same local residents. Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, who served as a squad leader for one of the reconnaissance units, mentioned to Sarah that her team had noticed increased activity around a particular compound about 8 kilometers from the base. The compound had previously appeared to be a simple residential structure, but recent observations suggested that it was being used for meetings involving large numbers of people arriving and leaving at odd hours. This information was particularly significant to Sarah because the compound Gonzalez described matched the location of a suspected enemy command center that had been identified in intelligence briefings she had received through her covert channels. The fact that activity at the location was increasing suggested that operational planning was reaching a critical phase. Sarah faced a dilemma that was central to the challenges of the embedded asset program. She had gathered intelligence that suggested an imminent threat to Camp Phoenix, but she couldn't act on this information without potentially compromising her cover. The protocols for embedded assets were clear about the importance of maintaining operational security, but they also emphasized the need to protect coalition forces when possible. The solution required careful consideration of how to provide warning without revealing her true capabilities. Sarah decided to approach the situation indirectly by raising medical concerns that might prompt increased security awareness among the base leadership. She began by preparing a memo for the base medical officer about potential health risks associated with disrupted supply deliveries and the absence of local staff. In the memo, she noted that these disruptions could indicate broader security issues that might affect the base's ability to maintain proper medical readiness. She suggested that medical personnel should be prepared for the possibility of increased casualty loads and that emergency medical supplies should be verified and prepared for immediate use. The medical officer, Captain James Thompson, reviewed Sarah's memo with interest but didn't immediately recognize its broader implications. He agreed with her recommendations about medical preparedness, but viewed them as routine precautionary measures rather than responses to specific threat indicators. Sarah's next step was to engage Lieutenant Rodriguez in a conversation that might prompt him to investigate the patterns she had observed. She approached him during dinner, ostensibly to discuss medical support for an upcoming patrol, but gradually steered the conversation toward the disruptions in normal base operations. Rodriguez found himself impressed by Sarah's observational skills and her thoughtful analysis of seemingly routine events. He began to see connections between the various disruptions that he hadn't previously considered significant. The conversation prompted him to review his own intelligence files and to look for patterns that might support Sarah's concerns. What Rodriguez discovered alarmed him. When he correlated the timing of supply disruptions with intercepted communications and patrol reports, a clear picture emerged of coordinated preparation for a significant operation. The enemy appeared to be isolating the base by disrupting normal logistics while conducting detailed surveillance of coalition movements and capabilities. The intelligence officer faced his own operational challenge. His growing suspicions about Sarah suggested that she might have access to information or training that went beyond standard medical preparation. Her insights were too sophisticated and too accurate to be the result of simple observation. Rodriguez began to consider the possibility that Sarah was not what she appeared to be. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to gather intelligence while preparing for multiple contingencies. She discreetly checked the base's medical supplies and equipment, ensuring that everything needed for mass casualty treatment was readily available. She also began positioning herself to have quick access to communications equipment and emergency procedures that might be needed if the base came under attack. The evening brought additional confirmation of Sarah's assessment. Radio intercepts detected through her covert monitoring equipment indicated increased chatter among known hostile groups. The communications were heavily coded, but Sarah's training in signals intelligence allowed her to identify patterns that suggested final preparations for an operation. More concerning was intelligence from her handlers indicating that other coalition bases in the region had detected similar patterns of enemy preparation. The scope of the planned attacks appeared to be much larger than anything previously attempted, involving coordinated strikes against multiple targets designed to disrupt coalition operations throughout the region. This information placed Sarah in an impossible position. The scale of the threat meant that hundreds of coalition soldiers were at risk, but revealing what she knew would compromise not only her own mission, but potentially the entire embedded asset program. The decision about whether to break cover could only be made if the threat became imminent, and no other options remained available. Rodriguez spent the evening reviewing intelligence files and patrol reports, trying to piece together the threat picture that Sarah's observations had helped him identify. He found himself increasingly convinced that a major attack was being planned, but he also realized that his evidence was largely circumstantial. Military commanders required more concrete intelligence before they would authorize significant changes to base operations or alert levels. The intelligence officer decided to approach his commanding officer with his concerns, but he knew he would need to present a compelling case based on verifiable evidence. He began preparing a briefing that would outline the threat indicators without revealing his suspicions about Sarah's true identity or capabilities. As night fell over Camp Phoenix, both Sarah and Rodriguez found themselves preparing for events that would test their professional skills and personal courage. The base appeared calm and routine to most of its inhabitants, but the two individuals who had recognized the warning signs knew that the next few hours would likely bring violence and chaos that would challenge everything they had learned about warfare and survival. Sarah lay in her bunk reviewing the options available to her if the expected attack materialized. Her training had prepared her for this moment, but knowing that soldiers she had come to care about were in danger made the prospect of maintaining her cover much more difficult. She had spent months building relationships with people who trusted her as their medic, and the thought of watching them face unknown dangers while she held back her capabilities was almost unbearable. Rodriguez worked late into the night preparing his intelligence assessment, knowing that the morning briefing with base leadership might be his only opportunity to prevent a catastrophe. He had decided not to mention his suspicions about Sarah, focusing instead on the threat indicators that he could document and verify through official channels. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force both individuals to make decisions that would define not only their own futures, but potentially the fate of everyone at Camp Phoenix. The quiet medic and the observant intelligence officer had independently identified a threat that others had missed, and now they faced the challenge of finding a way to protect their fellow soldiers without compromising their own missions and responsibilities. The first explosions shattered the pre-dawn silence at 0347 hours, sending Sarah Chun tumbling from her bunk as the ground beneath Camp Phoenix shook with devastating force. The coordinated mortar attack had begun exactly as her intelligence analysis had predicted, but the reality of experiencing it was far more intense than anything she had prepared for during her training. Emergency sirens wailed across the base as soldiers scrambled to their defensive positions. Sarah could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming rounds followed by thunderous explosions that sent dirt and debris raining down on the temporary structures that housed the camp's personnel. The attack was more sophisticated and better coordinated than anything the base had experienced during her 18 months of service. Within minutes, it became clear that this was not a random harassment attack designed to disrupt sleep and morale. The enemy had positioned multiple mortar teams at calculated distances to provide overlapping fields of fire that covered the entire base. The timing of the rounds indicated that the attackers had detailed knowledge of the camp's layout and had specifically targeted key installations including the communications center, vehicle maintenance areas, and command facilities. Sarah moved quickly through the chaos, her medical training taking precedence as wounded soldiers began calling for help. The first casualties were arriving at the medical tent even before the initial barrage had ended, and she could see that the medical team would be overwhelmed within minutes. The base's 4 medics were trained to handle routine injuries and limited combat casualties, not the mass casualty event that was rapidly developing. As she worked to treat a soldier with severe shrapnel wounds to his legs, Sarah's enhanced training allowed her to process multiple streams of information simultaneously. She could hear the sound of small arms fire beginning to mix with the explosions, indicating that the mortar attack was serving as preparation for a ground assault. The enemy was following a classic combined arms approach that suggested significant planning and military expertise. Lieutenant Rodriguez had made it to the command bunker where he was trying to coordinate intelligence gathering and communications with higher headquarters. The initial reports painted a grim picture of a well-planned attack involving at least 60 enemy combatants armed with mortars, automatic weapons, and rocket-propelled grenades. The communications disruption caused by the initial bombardment meant that requests for reinforcement and air support were severely delayed. What Rodriguez had not anticipated was the sophistication of the enemy's intelligence preparation. The attackers appeared to know exactly where to strike to cause maximum disruption while minimizing their own exposure to defensive fire. They had positioned themselves to take advantage of terrain features that provided cover and concealment while allowing them to maintain effective fire on the base. Sarah faced an agonizing decision as the medical situation deteriorated rapidly. Two of the base's medics had been injured in the initial bombardment, leaving her and one colleague to treat more than 20 wounded soldiers. The standard medical protocols were completely inadequate for the situation, and she could see that soldiers would die unless she took action that went beyond her supposed capabilities. Her training as an embedded asset had included advanced combat medicine that went far beyond standard medic instruction. She had learned surgical techniques, advanced trauma management, and emergency procedures that could save lives in extreme situations. However, using these skills would immediately reveal that her background was far more extensive than anyone at Camp Phoenix believed. The sound of automatic weapons fire was getting closer to the medical tent, indicating that enemy forces had breached the base perimeter and were advancing toward the central areas where the wounded were being treated. Sarah could hear American voices shouting warnings and coordinating defensive efforts, but the volume of enemy fire suggested that the defenders were being overwhelmed. At 0421 hours, the decision was taken out of Sarah's hands when an enemy rocket-propelled grenade struck the communications bunker where Lieutenant Rodriguez was coordinating the defense. The explosion killed 3 soldiers instantly and left Rodriguez unconscious with severe head trauma and internal injuries. When the surviving personnel carried him to the medical tent, Sarah found herself facing a situation that demanded immediate action. Rodriguez required emergency surgery to relieve pressure on his brain and to address internal bleeding that would kill him within minutes. The procedure needed advanced surgical techniques and equipment that officially didn't exist at Camp Phoenix. Sarah looked at the unconscious intelligence officer who had suspected her true identity and realized that maintaining her cover would mean letting him die. Without hesitation, Sarah began revealing capabilities that shocked the wounded soldiers around her. She produced advanced medical equipment from concealed storage areas and began performing neurosurgery with skill that was impossible to explain through routine medic training. Her movements were precise and confident as she worked to save Rodriguez's life, while simultaneously directing the treatment of other wounded soldiers with expertise that transformed the medical response. Sergeant Gonzalez, who had been wounded in the leg but remained conscious, watched Sarah work with growing amazement. The quiet medic who had always seemed competent but unremarkable was displaying surgical skills that rivaled those of the trauma surgeons Gonzalez had observed at major military hospitals. Sarah's hands moved with practiced confidence as she performed procedures that should have been impossible given the equipment and conditions in the field medical tent. The transformation in Sarah's demeanor was as dramatic as the revelation of her medical skills. Gone was the quiet, self-effacing manner that had characterized her interactions with fellow soldiers. In its place was the confident authority of someone accustomed to taking charge in life and death situations. She issued clear, precise instructions to the remaining medical personnel and began organizing the treatment of wounded soldiers with efficiency that immediately improved their chances of survival. As Sarah worked to stabilize Rodriguez and coordinate treatment for other casualties, she found herself having to make rapid decisions about how much of her true capabilities to reveal. Each advanced technique she employed made her cover story less believable, but the alternative was watching soldiers die when she had the skills to save them. The enemy assault reached its peak intensity at 0445 hours when hostile forces launched a coordinated ground attack designed to overrun the base's defensive positions. Sarah could hear the battle raging outside the medical tent as American soldiers fought desperately to prevent enemy forces from reaching the camp's central areas where the wounded were being treated. Captain Thompson, the base medical officer, had been injured early in the attack, but remained conscious enough to observe Sarah's work. Despite his own pain, he found himself fascinated by techniques he had never seen performed in field conditions. Sarah was using equipment that he didn't remember being part of their standard medical supplies, and was performing procedures with a level of skill that suggested extensive surgical training. The sound of gunfire was getting progressively closer, and Sarah realized that enemy forces might soon reach the medical tent. Her training as an embedded asset had included extensive combat instruction, but revealing these capabilities would complete the destruction of her cover identity. She faced the choice between maintaining her medical focus and taking action to defend the wounded soldiers who couldn't protect themselves. At 0503 hours, the choice was made for her when 3 enemy combatants breached the perimeter around the medical area. They entered the tent with automatic weapons raised, apparently intent on eliminating the wounded soldiers who represented potential intelligence sources for coalition forces. What happened next shocked every conscious person in the medical tent. Sarah moved with speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone whose training was supposedly limited to medical care. In less than 15 seconds, she had disarmed 2 of the attackers and eliminated the threat they posed to the wounded soldiers. Her movements displayed combat training that was clearly far beyond anything provided to standard medical personnel. The third attacker, apparently surprised by the unexpected resistance, attempted to retreat, but found himself facing Sarah's continued pursuit. She neutralized the threat with techniques that demonstrated expertise in close combat that was inconsistent with her supposed background as a medical professional. Sergeant Gonzalez, despite his injuries, managed to capture the entire confrontation on his helmet camera. The recording would later provide clear evidence of capabilities that Sarah could never explain through her cover story as a routine medic. With the immediate threat eliminated, Sarah returned to treating wounded soldiers as if the combat interlude had been a minor interruption in her medical duties. However, the soldiers who had witnessed her actions were now looking at her with new awareness. The quiet medic who had blended into the background for 18 months had revealed abilities that raised fundamental questions about her identity and training. Lieutenant Rodriguez regained consciousness during Sarah's continued surgical work on his injuries. Despite the pain and confusion caused by his head trauma, he immediately recognized the significance of what he was witnessing. Sarah's medical skills, combined with the combat capabilities he had just observed, confirmed his suspicions about her true nature. The battle for Camp Phoenix continued to rage outside the medical tent, but the situation inside had been fundamentally transformed. Sarah could no longer maintain the pretense that she was simply a medic who had happened to perform well under pressure. Her cover had been irreversibly compromised, and she faced the challenge of operating openly while the soldiers she had sworn to protect processed the reality of her deception. As dawn broke over the embattled base, Sarah Chun found herself in a position she had trained for but hoped never to experience. Her secret identity had been exposed under the worst possible circumstances, and now she had to find a way to complete her mission while earning the trust of soldiers who had just learned that everything they believed about her was false. The immediate aftermath of the attack left Camp Phoenix in a state of controlled chaos, but nowhere was the transformation more evident than in the medical tent, where Sarah Chun continued to work with capabilities that defied every assumption her colleagues had held about her. As the sun climbed higher over the smoke-scarred landscape, the wounded soldiers she treated found themselves grappling with questions that challenged everything they thought they knew about the quiet medic who had just saved their lives. Lieutenant Rodriguez, despite his serious injuries, remained conscious and alert enough to understand the magnitude of what he had witnessed. The neurosurgical procedure that Sarah had performed to relieve pressure on his brain required knowledge and equipment that simply didn't exist in standard field medical units. The precision with which she had eliminated the enemy threat demonstrated combat training that was inconsistent with any medical program he knew about. Sergeant Gonzalez reviewed the footage from her helmet camera with growing amazement. The recording clearly showed Sarah moving with the fluid efficiency of someone who had received extensive close-quarters combat training. Her techniques were precise and deadly, executed with the kind of muscle memory that only came from years of intensive practice. This was not someone who had learned basic self-defense as part of routine military training. Captain Thompson, the base medical officer, found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about military medicine. Sarah's surgical capabilities exceeded those of trauma surgeons he had worked with at major medical centers. She had access to equipment that wasn't part of their standard inventory and had demonstrated knowledge of procedures that weren't taught in any military medical program he was familiar with. As the base's security situation stabilized and reinforcements arrived to secure the perimeter, attention began to focus on the extraordinary events that had occurred in the medical tent. Word spread quickly through the surviving soldiers about the medic who had revealed impossible capabilities when the situation demanded it. The story grew with each telling, but the core facts remained consistent and undeniable. Sarah faced a decision that would define the rest of her military career. Her cover had been irrevocably compromised, and she could no longer maintain the pretense that she was simply a well-trained medic who had performed exceptionally under pressure. The video evidence, combined with witness testimony from multiple soldiers, made any attempt at deception pointless and potentially damaging to the trust she needed to maintain with her colleagues. At 1,430 hours, Sarah requested a private meeting with the base commander, Colonel Patricia Williams, who had arrived with the reinforcement unit. The colonel had already reviewed preliminary reports about the medical response during the attack and had noted several inconsistencies that suggested something unusual had occurred. Colonel Williams entered the meeting with preconceptions about what she expected to hear. Reports of exceptional performance under pressure were common in combat situations, and she anticipated that she would be dealing with a medic who had perhaps exceeded her training slightly but had performed admirably when faced with extraordinary circumstances. What Sarah revealed during the next hour challenged every assumption Colonel Williams held about military personnel management and operational security. Sarah began by presenting her authentic military identification, which showed a rank and unit assignment that were completely different from what appeared in Camp Phoenix's personnel records. Major Sarah Elizabeth Chun held a commission in the 1st Special Operations Intelligence Battalion, a unit that Colonel Williams knew existed but had never encountered directly. Sarah's personnel file contained training records that read like a catalog of advanced military specialties: combat medicine, close-quarters combat, signals intelligence, psychological operations, and advanced weapons systems. The embedded asset program that Sarah described was unlike anything Colonel Williams had encountered during her 23-year military career. The concept of placing specially trained intelligence operatives in conventional military units as medical personnel represented a level of operational sophistication that impressed and concerned her in equal measure. Sarah explained that her mission at Camp Phoenix had been to gather intelligence on regional threat patterns while providing genuine medical support to coalition forces. The program's designers had recognized that embedded assets needed to maintain their cover roles effectively in order to be successful, which meant that Sarah's medical capabilities were authentic and substantial. The intelligence she had gathered over 18 months painted a comprehensive picture of enemy capabilities and intentions that had never been available through traditional collection methods. Her unique position had allowed her to correlate medical treatment data with operational information to identify patterns that revealed enemy tactics, training levels, and organizational structures. Colonel Williams found herself reviewing a detailed intelligence assessment that Sarah had prepared documenting the build-up to the attack on Camp Phoenix. The analysis showed clear warning indicators that had been present for weeks before the assault, along with Sarah's recommendations for defensive measures that could have reduced the casualties significantly. The revelation that Sarah had predicted the attack raised uncomfortable questions about military intelligence procedures and the communication of threat assessments. Sarah explained that the protocols governing embedded assets strictly limited their ability to share intelligence through normal channels, particularly when doing so might compromise their cover identities. Lieutenant Rodriguez, who had been cleared by medical personnel to participate in the debriefing despite his injuries, listened to Sarah's explanation with professional interest. Her intelligence analysis answered questions that he had been struggling with for months about enemy capabilities and coordination. The attack patterns she had identified explained the increasing sophistication of recent operations against coalition forces. What emerged from the extended debriefing was a picture of military innovation that pushed the boundaries of conventional thinking about intelligence operations. The embedded asset program represented an attempt to address fundamental limitations in traditional intelligence gathering by placing trained operatives in positions where they could observe and analyze enemy activities from unique perspectives. Sarah's performance during the attack had demonstrated the program's potential value, but it had also exposed its limitations. The protocols designed to protect embedded assets and maintain their cover proved inadequate when circumstances demanded immediate action to protect lives. The program's designers had apparently not fully considered scenarios where maintaining cover might conflict with operational necessities. Colonel Williams faced complex decisions about how to handle Sarah's situation and the broader implications of the embedded asset program. The success Sarah had achieved in gathering intelligence and protecting coalition forces was undeniable, but her exposure raised questions about operational security and the sustainability of similar operations. The soldiers who had witnessed Sarah's capabilities during the attack struggled with their own emotional responses to learning that someone they had trusted had been deceiving them about her identity. Sergeant Gonzalez expressed the conflicted feelings that many of them shared about discovering that their medic had been far more than she had appeared to be. Some soldiers felt betrayed by the deception, questioning whether Sarah's care and concern for them had been genuine or simply part of her cover role. Others focused on the lives she had saved and the competence she had displayed when their survival depended on her capabilities. The complex emotions reflected the inherent challenges of military operations that required deception to be effective. Sarah addressed these concerns directly in meetings with the soldiers she had served alongside for 18 months. She emphasized that her medical care had always been genuine and that her feelings of responsibility for their welfare had motivated her decision to reveal her true capabilities during the attack. The embedded asset program had required deception about her background, but it had not required her to be indifferent to the soldiers she worked with daily. The investigation that followed the attack revealed the full scope of Sarah's intelligence contributions and their impact on regional security operations. Her analysis had identified enemy capabilities and intentions that had been missed by traditional intelligence collection methods. The information she had gathered over 18 months would influence coalition strategy for years to come. Lieutenant Rodriguez found himself assigned to work with Sarah on a comprehensive assessment of the embedded asset program's effectiveness and potential for expansion. The partnership between an intelligence officer and an exposed embedded asset created opportunities for innovation in how intelligence operations could be integrated with conventional military operations. The attack on Camp Phoenix had resulted in significant casualties and damage, but it had also revealed capabilities and procedures that would reshape military intelligence operations. Sarah's success in maintaining her cover while gathering critical intelligence demonstrated the potential value of the embedded asset program, while her exposure highlighted the need for improved protocols and support structures. 6 months later, Major Sarah Chun found herself assigned to a new position training the next generation of embedded assets. Her experience at Camp Phoenix had become a case study in the challenges and opportunities of deep cover intelligence operations. The lessons learned from her mission would influence how the military approached intelligence gathering in complex operational environments. The soldiers who had served with Sarah at Camp Phoenix carried with them a new understanding of the complexity and sophistication of modern military operations. Their experience had shown them that the conventional distinctions between different military specialties were often artificial, and that the most effective soldiers were those who could adapt their capabilities to meet the demands of evolving situations. Sarah's story became part of the institutional memory of the units that had been affected by her mission. The quiet medic who had revealed extraordinary capabilities when circumstances demanded it served as an example of the dedication and skill that characterized the military's most effective personnel, regardless of their official job descriptions or public identities. The embedded asset program continued to evolve based on the lessons learned from Sarah's experience and the experiences of other operatives who served in similar roles. The balance between maintaining operational security and providing effective support to military operations remained a constant challenge, but the program's successes demonstrated that innovative approaches to intelligence gathering could provide capabilities that traditional methods could not achieve. Years later, when former soldiers from Camp Phoenix shared stories about their military service, they often spoke of the medic who had been far more than she appeared to be. Sarah Chin's legacy was not just in the lives she had saved or the intelligence she had gathered, but in the example she had set of military professionalism that transcended conventional categories and expectations.